Have you ever stumbled upon a secret so powerful it rearranged the pieces of your own history? I hadn't until the afternoon I found the diary. It was a late September day, the kind that seemed to hum with the last golden notes of summer, while the first hints of autumn crept through the open attic window. Dust motes hung in the slanting light as I, Clara Donnelly, stood on a rickety wooden chair, surrounded by boxes of yellowed newspapers, brittle Christmas ornaments, and the smell of old books and cedar. My grandfather's attic was the kind of place stories began, a place where generations of secrets slept, tucked between forgotten photo albums and war medals that had lost their shine. I was supposed to be cleaning out the attic to help my mum, but what I was really doing was looking for him, for answers. Grandpa Elliot had always been a fixture in my life. Kind blue eyes, gentle voice, a sly, teasing humor that made the world seem less serious. But after he died in the spring, it felt like I was missing a chapter of his story, a chapter he'd never told us. That's when I found it. A battered, leather-bound diary, wedged between a stack of old National Geographics and a tin box of ration coupons. The cover was scratched and soft, the edges bent from decades of handling. As I ran my fingers over the initials, EJD, I felt a strange jolt, as if the attic itself was holding its breath. Inside the front cover, pressed flat and faded with time, was a black and white photograph. It showed a young man in a crisp, unfamiliar uniform, his jaw set but his eyes warm. Beside him, a woman in a nurse's dress, her dark hair pinned under a cap, stood with her hand just brushing his sleeve. She wasn't anyone I recognized, not my grandmother, not any relative I'd ever heard stories about. Yet the way they leaned toward each other, the way the corners of their mouths curved just so, told a different story, a secret one. Who was this woman? And why had Grandpa never mentioned her? Carefully, I turned the brittle first page. The diary began in a looping, earnest script, the ink faded but legible. London, the 17th of February, 1943. The city is a wound that never quite heals. I arrived last week, snow clinging to the rooftops, the streets full of people who walk quickly, eyes fixed ahead, as if hurrying away from a memory. I write this from the barracks, but my mind is somewhere else. Maybe back home, maybe in the future, somewhere safe. Maybe that doesn't exist anymore. As I read, the dusty attic seemed to dissolve, replaced by the sights and sounds of wartime London, the distant rumble of air raid sirens, the acrid scent of smoke, the tremor in the ground as bombs fell miles away. And in the center of it all, my grandfather, not yet the gentle old man I knew, but a young radio operator named Elliot Donnelly, adrift in a city at war. The London that greeted Elliot was a city of shadows and resilience. The winter of 1943 pressed hard against the city's bones, breath frosted in the air, and the sky hung low, bruised by smoke from distant fires. Buildings along the Thames still bore the wounds of nightly raids, gaping craters where homes had stood, shattered glass glittering in the gutters. Blackout curtains hung in every window, giving the streets an unearthly hush after dark. Even in daylight, people moved with a kind of purposeful unease. Ration books clutched tight, eyes wary for the next siren's wail. Elliot was 23, fresh from Boston, his accent clipped yet softened by the city's rhythm. He wore his uniform like a borrowed coat, proud, but never quite at ease. The US Army Air Forces had sent him to London to handle radio communications, sending messages between the front and home, relaying words of hope, grief, and longing across oceans and battle lines. He lived in cramped barracks on the edge of the city, the ceilings low and the heat unreliable, each night punctuated by the thud and roll of distant explosions. For all his quiet humor and easy smile, Elliot felt the city's loneliness keenly. Letters from home, his mother's careful handwriting, his younger sister's childish scrawl, were treasures, read and reread in the flickering light of blackout lamps. But the days stretched long and the nights longer, filled with the ghosts of voices he'd carried over the airwaves. Tell my wife I'm all right. Let my mother know I'll be home soon. Don't worry about me. It was the hospital that finally gave him purpose. One cold morning, after a sleepless night interrupted by sirens, Elliot volunteered for extra duty in the radio room at St. Agnes's Hospital, a sprawling brick building in Bloomsbury, patched with sandbags and streaked with soot. There, amid the clatter of typewriters and the low moan of ambulances, he found himself surrounded by wounded men, nurses moving swiftly down the dim corridors, the air thick with antiseptic and whispered prayers. He spent his shifts hunched over the transmitter, his fingers flying across the keys as he tapped out messages for soldiers who couldn't hold a pen. "Tell them I'm healing," one would murmur, his voice strained. "Tell her I love her," another would say, tears slipping down his unshaven face. Elliot wrote them all, his own heart aching with every word. It was in those crowded, echoing halls that he first saw her. Margaux Fournier moved through the chaos of St. Agnes's with a grace Elliot found mesmerizing. She was 21, her dark hair always neatly pinned beneath her nurse's cap, her eyes a deep, serious brown that missed nothing. She spoke with a soft French accent, her words careful but quick, her laughter rare but genuine. To her patients, she was a calm in the storm, her touch gentle, her voice steady, even when the world outside rattled with bombs. Margaux had come to London 2 years before, fleeing Paris in the wake of the German occupation. Her father, once a tailor on the Rue de Rivoli, had urged her to go. "It is not safe, ma chérie. You must survive." She carried his words with her, along with a single photograph and a hand-stitched handkerchief hidden in the pocket of her dress. Life in London was survival, but it was also exile. Margaux pined for the city she'd left behind, the cafes along the Seine, the smell of fresh bread at dawn, the gentle cadence of her mother's voice. Here her days were spent tending wounds and writing letters for men whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She learned to ration sugar, to sleep through air raids, to push her own grief aside for the sake of others. Still, there were moments when the weight of loss pressed too hard. A child's toy in the rubble, a song on the radio that reminded her of home, the emptiness that lingered after the last patient had been settled for the night. The night their stories entwined began like so many others, London cloaked in darkness, the city's heart beating fast beneath the threat of another raid. The hospital lights were dimmed, blackout curtains drawn tight, the halls echoing with hurried footsteps and the distant thrum of engines overhead. Elliot was in the radio room, his ears straining for the familiar static, when the sirens began to wail, a sound that sliced through bone and memory. He grabbed his jacket and hurried into the corridor, the air thick with fear and the sharp scent of disinfectant. Nurses shepherded patients into the basement, their voices calm but urgent. In the confusion, he nearly collided with Margaux at the foot of the stairs. She was guiding an elderly man in a wheelchair, her hand steady on his shoulder. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers wide but steady, his searching for something to anchor him. In that instant, amid the chaos and the pressing dark, a silent understanding passed between them. A sudden tremor shook the building, dust drifting from the ceiling. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the corridor into inky blackness. Someone cried out, a young soldier, his leg bandaged, panic twisting his voice. Margaux knelt beside him, her words soft and rapid, the French slipping through before she caught herself and switched to English. Elliot crouched beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. "You're all right, mate," he said gently, reaching for the soldier's hand. "Stay with us, just a power cut, nothing more." Margaux nodded, her hand steady on the boy's shoulder. "Breathe, monsieur. Like this." She inhaled slowly, demonstrating, and the boy mimicked her, his breath shuddering but slowing. They stayed there, side by side in the dark, their voices weaving a fragile thread of calm through the fear. Elliot found himself translating Margaux's murmured French, his accent clumsy but his intent clear. The boy's grip loosened, his panic ebbing as the danger passed overhead, the bombs falling somewhere else this time. When the all-clear finally sounded, a collective sigh rippled through the basement. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating the dust and the exhausted, grateful faces. Margaux rose, smoothing her skirt, her eyes meeting Elliot's with a flicker of gratitude, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. He offered her a lopsided smile. "Nice teamwork, Nurse Fournier." She smiled back, a small, weary thing, but real. "Merci, Sergeant Donnelly. I think we make a good team." In that moment, surrounded by the bruised and the brave, the frightened and the hopeful, something shifted. Not just relief, but a spark, an understanding that ran deeper than words, deeper than the war that raged outside. As I sat in the attic, the diary open on my lap, I traced the faded photograph with my thumb. The young man and the nurse, Elliot and Margaux, my grandfather, and a woman whose name no one in my family had ever spoken. What had happened to her? Why had he never mentioned her, not to my grandmother, not to my mother, not to me? And why, all these years later, did the memory of her linger in the fragile pages of his diary? I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of wartime London echo in my mind. The sirens, the hurried footsteps, the gentle hush of a nurse's voice in the dark. A love story hidden in plain sight. I had to know more. The attic was quiet except for the creak of floorboards beneath my feet and the soft, shuddering breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My grandfather's diary sat in my lap, its leather cover warm from the sunlight streaming through the dusty glass. The photograph, edges curled, faces frozen in another lifetime, rested between the pages like a pressed flower. I traced the outline of the nurse's gentle smile with my thumb, my mind echoing with questions I'd never thought to ask. I flipped the diary open again, inhaling the musty scent of old ink. The handwriting was neat, a little slanted, with a steadiness that belied the chaos he must have witnessed. The next entry was dated March 19th, 1943. As I read, the attic faded away, and I was swept into the city he described, a city at war, holding its breath between the drone of sirens and the crash of bombs. Elliot Donnelly had learned to listen for silence. In London, silence was never just quiet. It was the moment before something happened, a bomb, a letter, a memory. He stood at the corner of Southampton Street, rain mottling the brim of his cap, watching a line of women queue outside the butcher's. Ration books fluttered in gloved hands. The city seemed stitched together by hope and habit, its wounds hidden beneath blackout curtains and polite nods. He pulled his coat tighter. The radio room at St. Bartholomew's Hospital was a few blocks away, and the air was sharp with the promise of another raid. The streets were never empty, but everyone hurried, faces pinched and pale. Children hopped puddles, boots patched with old rubber. A delivery boy pedaled past, his bicycle basket piled with parcels wrapped in brown paper and string. Elliot's shift began before dusk. The hospital was a patchwork of pressed uniforms and hushed voices, the corridors lined with cots that spilled into the foyer after each heavy night. He had volunteered for the radio room because it was a way to help, but also because it was a way to connect, to home, to something steady. Every night he transcribed messages for men whose hands shook too badly to write, who whispered last words for mothers and sweethearts across the ocean. Margaux Fournier was there, as she often was, her blue dress faded at the elbows, a white apron tied in a neat bow behind her back. She moved between beds with brisk efficiency, but there was a gentleness in the way she tucked blankets around feverish soldiers or pressed a cool cloth to a brow. Her English was careful, shaped by the soft cadence of Paris, but she spoke little unless spoken to. Tonight, she paused at the radio room door, a stack of letters clutched to her chest. Elliot looked up from his desk, catching her in the flickering lamplight. For a moment everything else receded, the ache in his shoulders, the static from the wireless, the distant thunder of the city bracing for another night. "Bonsoir, Elliot," she said, her voice low. "I have more messages for you. From the men in Ward C." He nodded, gesturing to the spare chair. "Take a seat, Margaux. I'll type as you read." She sat, smoothing her skirt, and began to read. The letters were simple. "I am well. Tell mother not to worry. I dream of the river, of home." Elliot typed each word, glancing up now and then to catch the flicker of emotion in her eyes. When the last letter was finished, a hush fell over them. Outside, searchlights swept the sky. Margaux tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Do you ever write home?" she asked suddenly. Elliot hesitated. "Sometimes my mother writes every week, even if I don't answer." He offered a rueful smile. "She worries I'll forget how to eat properly." Margaux laughed, a sound so light it almost startled him. "Maman is the same. She would send soup by post if she could." He leaned back, studying her. "You ever hear from her?" "Your mother?" A shadow crossed Margot's face. "Only once since Paris. She is safe, I think. But letters are slow and sometimes—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "I miss her." I bet she misses you too." They sat in companionable silence, the radio hissing softly. Elliot reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "Here," he said, passing it over. "You can read it if you like. My mother's letters are always cheerful, even when she's scolding me." Margaux smiled, unfolding the paper. She read aloud, her accent turning the words gentle. "Dear Elliot, your father nearly lost his hat in the wind again. Boston is muddy and cold. I made your favorite pie for your birthday, and your sister ate the last slice." As she read, Elliot closed his eyes, picturing home, the narrow kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the radio humming in the background. He wondered if Margaux's Paris had felt the same before it changed, before the world tilted and nothing was certain anymore. "Thank you," she said, folding the letter carefully. "It is good to remember ordinary things." He nodded. "Yeah, sometimes that's all you've got." Days passed, measured in cups of weak tea, hurried meals in the crowded canteen, and nights broken by sirens. Elliot and Margaux worked side by side, their friendship growing in the spaces between duty and exhaustion. They shared stories. Elliot told her about Fenway Park and clam chowder. Margaux described summer evenings along the Seine, her father's laughter echoing from the tailor's shop. Sometimes, after their shifts, they walked together along the Thames, the city's jagged silhouette rising against the moonlit sky. One night, as they strolled beneath the battered arches of Southwark Bridge, Margaux stopped to gaze at the water. The river was dark and restless, flecked with the gold of distant lamps. "Do you think it will ever end?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer right away. He watched a barge drift by, its silhouette ghostly in the gloom. "I hope so," he said finally. "But I don't know what I'll be when it does." Margaux gripped the railing. "I am afraid to go home, afraid of what I will find, but I am more afraid of forgetting who I was there." He looked at her, seeing not just the nurse, but the orphan she was becoming piece by piece. "You won't forget. I don't think you could, even if you tried." She smiled, but her eyes were wet. "Promise me you'll write. If you leave London." "I promise," Elliot said. He meant it. Spring blurred into summer, the city stitched together by hope and routine. In the hospital, news filtered in from the front. Victories and losses measured in columns of print, and faces missing from the breakfast queue. Elliot found himself watching the door for Margaux, listening for her laughter in the corridors. There was comfort in her presence, in the way she noticed when he skipped meals or forgot to sleep. One afternoon, as thunder rumbled over the city, Elliot was summoned to the commander's office. The message was blunt. He was being transferred to a forward airbase near Cambridge, effective immediately. He found Margaux in the dispensary, her arms dusted with flour from rolling bandages. "I have to go," he said, breathless. She looked up, eyes wide. "When?" "Tonight. Orders just came through." For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, heavy with words left unsaid. "I'll write," he said, voice thick. She nodded, folding her arms as if to hold herself together. "Be careful, Elliot." He wanted to say more, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he squeezed her hand, memorizing the lines of her face, the curve of her mouth, the stubborn tilt of her chin. He left before dusk, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, boots echoing in the marble hall. The train station was packed with men in uniform, relatives clutching handkerchiefs, children waving paper flags. Elliot found a seat by the window, heart pounding as London slipped away. Margaux stood by the hospital window, watching the sky bruise purple. She felt hollow, as if something vital had been uprooted. That night, as she folded sheets in the linen room, the matron found her. "There's a Red Cross mission to France," the matron said quietly. "They need French nurses to help in the liberated towns. You're on the list." Margaux's heart stuttered. France. Home. The word was heavy with longing and fear. She thought of her mother, her father's empty shop, the friends she'd left behind. "I need time to decide," she whispered. The matron nodded, understanding more than she said. "You should write to him," she said softly. "Before you go." Margaux stared at the letterhead on the desk, her hand trembling. She wanted to write to Elliot, to tell him she was scared, that she missed him already. But what if he never answered? What if, by the time her words reached him, it was too late? The diary entries grew more hurried, more scattered, as if Elliot had written them in snatched moments. He described the airbase, a world of engines and mud, nights spent listening to the distant rumble of bombers. He wrote about missing London, about dreaming of Margaux's laugh echoing down dim hospital halls. Every few pages, I found a pressed flower, a ticket stub, a fragment of a letter in careful French. Each artifact was a breadcrumb, leading me deeper into the mystery. Who was Margaux? Did she ever return to France? Did she and my grandfather find each other again, or did the war scatter them forever? I closed the diary, my heart racing. I needed answers. That night I sat at my desk, laptop open, the photograph propped against the lamp. I typed Margaux Fournier, London 1943, into the search bar, not sure what I expected to find. A name, a face, a trace of the woman who'd meant so much to my grandfather, and who somehow was part of the story that shaped our family. If only I could ask him, did he ever see her again? Did they get a second chance, or was their love swept away by the tides of history? I had to know how it ended. And if you're as curious as I am, subscribe and follow along as I unravel the rest of their story. Because sometimes the answers to our deepest questions are waiting just a page away. The diary page was soft and worn, as if pressed and handled countless times. Clara's hands trembled as she turned it, careful not to tear the thin paper. The blue ink had faded in places, but Elliot's script remained steady, looping and neat, revealing a young man's heart as the world teetered on the edge of chaos. She could almost hear the echo of boots on the cobblestones and the rumble of trains as the story drew her in, pulling her away from the dusty attic and into a world where every day felt borrowed. London, March 1944. The city was a patchwork of shadows and hurried footsteps. Smoke lingered in the air, clinging to the stones of bombed-out buildings, and every night, the wail of sirens stitched itself into the fabric of their lives. For Elliot Donnelly, London never truly slept. It was a city that existed in the space between hope and dread. The hospital was no different. Its corridors were lined with iron beds, the hush broken by the coughs and restless dreams of men who'd seen too much. Margaux Fournier moved from bed to bed, her face half lit by the swinging bulbs overhead, her voice gentle as she checked bandages and whispered encouragement in a blend of French and English. Elliot lingered in the radio room, the humming wires and blinking lights a strange comfort. Each evening he waited for her, sometimes catching only a glimpse as she hurried past in her crisp nurse's uniform, her hair twisted beneath her cap. But tonight was different. Tonight, he waited for Margaux with something heavy in his pocket, something he'd spent hours crafting in stolen moments. He heard her before he saw her, the soft cadence of her voice floating down the corridor. When she entered, her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but she smiled at him. That smile undid him every time. "You are on duty late," she said, her accent curling around the words. "Couldn't sleep," Elliot replied, forcing a crooked grin. He hesitated, feeling the letter in his pocket like a live coal. There's something I want to give you." Margaux tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. He fumbled, pulling the folded letter from his pocket, and held it out to her. She took it delicately as if it might shatter. "C'est pour moi?" "For you," Elliot said, his throat tight. I thought it was easier to write it down." Margaux nodded, pressing the letter to her heart. "Merci, Elliot. I will read it." But before she could slip away, the hospital's intercom crackled to life. "Attention. All staff to the main ward. Incoming casualties expected. Prepare for triage." The moment fractured. Margaux hurried away, the letter tucked into her pocket, and Elliot watched her go, the words he'd written hanging in the air between them, unsaid. The city's heartbeat quickened that night. Ambulances screamed through the streets. The hospital became a blur of movement, orderlies and nurses and doctors working with a frantic precision, patching wounds, whispering comfort, sometimes only able to offer a hand to hold. Elliot found himself drafted into service, ferrying supplies, translating for French airmen, offering whatever help he could. Hours slipped by, the sky outside shifting from black to a dirty grey. When the chaos finally ebbed, he collapsed onto a bench near the back entrance, his uniform streaked with blood and dust. Margaux found him there some time before dawn. She looked impossibly tired, but her eyes were bright. "I read your letter," she said softly. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest. "And?" She sat beside him, so close he could see the tremor in her hands. "You wrote of Boston, your family, the things you miss, the smell of bread, your mother's garden, the sea, and you wrote of me." He swallowed. "I meant every word." Margaux looked away, her jaw tight. "I am afraid, Elliot. Afraid to hope. Every time I care for someone, they are sent away. Or worse. I do not want to lose you too." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We can't know what will happen, but I want to try. I want to be with you, Margaux, for as long as we have." For a long moment neither spoke. The city outside was waking, the church bells chiming the hour. She squeezed his hand. Perhaps we can find a way." Clara paused her reading, the attic suddenly too small for the surge of feeling in her chest. She recognized the handwriting, the yearning in the words. This was the love story her grandfather had hidden all these years, a story that seemed to burn through the decades. She hurried to her laptop, searching for any mention of a Margaux Fournier in wartime records. There were a few scattered references, a Red Cross nurse, a French expatriate, but nothing that answered the question burning inside her. What happened to them? The diary's next entry was hurried, the script jagged. March 14th, 1944. Orders came through. "I'm to report to Bassingbourn at first light. Forward airbase." I tried to find Margaux, but she was gone. On shift, or perhaps already at the train station. I left another letter with Nurse Bailey, praying it will reach her. I told her everything. Everything. Clara's heart pounded. She flipped the page, breathless. Paddington Station was chaos. Smoke curled in the rafters, sunlight falling in broken shards across the crowded platform. Soldiers and nurses and civilians pressed shoulder to shoulder, voices drowned by the roar of departing trains. Margaux pushed through the throng, her suitcase bumping against her knees. She clutched Elliot's letter in her gloved hand, heart hammering with every step. She had worked all night, but she would not let him go without seeing him one last time. She scanned the crowd, searching for his familiar face. Panic threatened to choke her. What if she was too late? What if he had already gone? Then, there, by the far end of the platform, his cap in his hands, his eyes scanning the crowd. Elliot. Relief flooded her so intensely she nearly wept. She called his name. "Elliot!" And he turned, his face breaking into a disbelieving smile. He closed the distance between them in seconds, and suddenly they were together, the world narrowing to this one moment. "I thought I'd missed you," Elliot said, voice strained with emotion. Margaux shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I could not let you leave without saying goodbye." He reached for her, holding her tightly. Around them people surged and hurried, the loudspeaker blaring destinations, but they stood still, an island in the storm. "I don't know when, if I'll be back," he whispered. She pressed the letter to his chest. "I will wait, however long." Elliot cupped her face, brushing away her tears. "You once told me hope was a stubborn thing. So is love. I love you, Margaux." She smiled through her tears. "And I love you, Elliot Donnelly." The train's whistle shrieked, urgent and final. Elliot hesitated, then pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss full of promise and desperation. "Promise me you'll be safe," she said. He nodded, though neither of them could believe it. The conductor called for boarding. Elliot squeezed her hand one last time, eyes shining. "Write to me. Find me somehow when it's over. Promise?" "I promise." He turned and boarded, the carriage filling with soldiers. Margaux stood on tiptoe, watching until the train pulled away, carrying him out of sight. She remained on the platform long after, the letter clutched in her hand, heart aching with hope and fear. Clara pressed her palm to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She reread the diary's next, shorter entry. "Some things you cannot say out loud, not even to a page. I am afraid. But I believe in her. I believe in us." She closed the book and leaned back, listening to the rain tapping against the attic window. For the first time, her grandfather was not just a faded photograph or a story told at family gatherings. He was a young man in love, a man who had risked everything. Her phone buzzed, a new email. Clara blinked, then opened it. It was from the online archive in Paris she'd contacted late last night, on a whim. Asterisk, Dear Miss Donnelly. Asterisk regarding your inquiry about Margaux Fournier. We have located a post-war record. Margaux Fournier, nurse, listed as married in 1947 in Boston, Massachusetts, to an Elliot Donnelly. Further details available upon request. Clara let out a shaky breath, laughter and tears mingling in her chest. The love story in the diary, her grandfather's secret, was not a story of loss but of reunion. Against all odds, they had found each other again. She looked at the faded photograph. Elliot in uniform, Margaux in her nurse's dress, both impossibly young, impossibly brave. I found you, Clara whispered. Both of you. Outside, the rain eased, and for the first time, the attic felt full of light. Clara's hands trembled as she turned the final fragile page of her grandfather's diary. The attic had grown colder, the quiet thick with expectation, as if the shadows themselves leaned closer to listen. Outside, the sun was slipping behind the maples, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. She barely noticed. Her world was still and hushed, narrowed to the sepia ink on the thin, worn paper in her lap. The last entry bore a date, May 1944. Elliot's handwriting, usually so crisp, wandered uncertainly across the page, as though he'd written it hurriedly, or with a heart too heavy to keep his hand steady. I saw her for the last time among the steam and smoke of Paddington. Margot's coat was too thin for the chill, but her eyes were bright, brave as always. I wanted to say I'd come back. I wanted to promise her Paris in the spring, my mother's garden in Boston, a life after the sirens. But the war eats promises. All I could do was press her hand and remember the way she smiled, sad but proud. I told her I loved her. I meant it more than I've meant anything. If I never see her again, I hope she finds peace. I hope she remembers me not as a soldier, but as a man who tried to be worthy of the love she showed me. Clara felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest, and for a moment she simply sat there, the attic air thick with memory and longing. She thought of Elliot, not the grandfather who'd taught her to skip stones or shown her how to fix a leaky faucet, but the young man in the photograph, standing next to a woman she had never known, in a world torn by bombs and hope. But the diary didn't end with that parting. Tucked between its last pages was a folded letter, its edges brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It was addressed in careful French to Mademoiselle Margaux Fournier, care of British Red Cross Paris. Clara's breath caught. She unfolded it slowly, heart pounding. My dearest Margaux. Asterisk. If you read this, it means that time or chance or some small miracle has brought you back to Paris. I hope the city is healing. I hope you are too. I think of you, always. I try to carry the courage you taught me, even when the sky is black with planes and the news is bad. I want you to know, loving you made me brave. Whatever happens, wherever you go, please remember that a boy from Boston carries your story in his heart. Yours always, Elliot. Clara pressed the letter to her chest. The diary, the letter, the photograph. They weren't just relics. They were a bridge across time, a whisper from the past, a secret love story that had shaped the man she'd known as Grandpa. But the story didn't end there. Not for Clara. She needed to know what had become of Margaux. A woman brave enough to love in the ruins, to hope against the darkness. She felt their unfinished story like an ache, a call to action. Clara spent the next week lost in research, her laptop glowing late into the night. She scoured archives, hospital records, Red Cross lists, and even old French newspapers digitized for the internet. Her French was rusty, but determination made her fluent. She found a mention, a Margaux Fournier, nurse, Paris, 1945, commended for her service at the Hôtel Dieu Hospital during the liberation. There was no photograph, just a brief line. For courage and compassion during wartime. It was enough. Clara sat back, letting the realization wash over her. Margaux had survived. She'd returned to her city, rebuilt a life among the ashes, and been remembered for her kindness. There was no record of her marrying, no obituary linking her to Elliot, but their story wasn't one of fairy tale endings. It was richer, more real, a love that illuminated the darkest of days, even if fate pulled them apart. Clara thought of her grandfather again, of the quiet wisdom in his eyes, the gentle humor that had seen her through her own storms. She understood now. Some love stories aren't measured by wedding rings or shared last names, but by the courage they inspire. By the way they echo through generations, urging us to be braver, kinder, more hopeful. She closed the diary for the final time, but the story lingered in her heart, a warmth, a lesson. Clara realized that she, too, was part of this legacy. The courage to seek, to love, to remember, these were her inheritance. She found herself at the local park the next afternoon, diary in hand, the autumn sun warming her face. Children laughed in the distance. The world, for all its scars, was still turning. She sat on a bench and reflected on everything she'd learned, not just about her grandfather, but about herself. It was easy to think of history as something distant, locked away in attics and textbooks. But Clara knew better now. History lived in letters, in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the love we carry forward. She wondered how many other stories waited in the attics of the world, waiting for someone to listen. As she watched the golden leaves drift to the ground, Clara smiled. She knew she'd never look at her grandfather's memory the same way again. His story, Elliot's story, wasn't just about war and loss. It was about finding hope in the rubble, about loving fiercely even when tomorrow wasn't promised. It was about choosing compassion, over and over, no matter how dark the night. And in some quiet, secret way, it was now about her as well. So, if you've ever found yourself wondering about the people who came before you, about the secrets hidden in old diaries or the faded faces in photographs, maybe this is your sign. Go look. Ask questions. Listen to the stories, even the unfinished ones. You never know what kind of love, courage, or hope you might uncover. If this story moved you, if you've ever discovered a part of your family's past that changed the way you see yourself, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe you'll inspire someone else to start their own search. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of ordinary people living through extraordinary times, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter from history's hidden hearts. Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't in the history books, they're waiting in the quiet corners of our own lives, just waiting for us to find them. Thank you for listening and for remembering.